So I think we can start. My name is Jürgen. I'm working at SUSE in the virtualization team. Main responsibility is normally the Xen-related code in the Linux kernel, but I'm doing some hypervisor work as well. So today I'm going to tell you something about core scheduling in the Xen hypervisor. What I'll be covering is what is core scheduling, why do we want to do it, how does it work at all. I have some preliminary performance numbers, and then I tell something about the current state of the work. So what is core scheduling? Today we have a normal CPU scheduling. So on each physical CPU, the scheduler in the Xen hypervisor is deciding which vCPU is to be scheduled next. Normally, the scheduler is looking at other physical CPUs only to decide, well, is another CPU loaded too much, or is the work I can steal from? And each vCPU can normally run on each physical CPU within some constraints put up by the user, maybe by CPU pools or pinning a vCPU to specific physical CPUs. But other than that, there are normally no constraints. In contrast to that, CPU scheduling, right? So normally I have, let's say, DOM0 running with some vCPUs on the physical CPUs, and some other CPUs, virtual CPUs, are blocked or idle. And this can change when I'm running another DOM-U. So the DOM-U vCPUs will be scheduled on the physical CPUs as well. When another, for example, DOM0 vCPU is being scheduled, then it can happen that a DOM-U vCPU is put into the run queue because there are no other physical CPUs available, but physical CPUs don't have any constraints which vCPUs can be run on. So on a specific core, I can mix vCPUs of different domains without any problem, and they can move around. With core scheduling, the scheduler is no longer acting on virtual CPUs or CPUs, but on virtual or physical cores. So what this means is all siblings or threads of a core are scheduled together. And the scheduling of all siblings of a single physical core is synchronized. So the relation between virtual cores and virtual CPUs is fixed, not as in core-aware scheduling, where the vCPUs are still scheduled individually, but just looking at the other siblings of the core. But the virtual cores are always consisting of the same virtual CPUs. And pinning and CPU pools are affecting cores, no longer CPUs. So when I'm pinning a virtual CPU to a specific physical CPU, this will affect all virtual CPUs of the same virtual core. So going to the picture again, I'm now scheduling virtual cores on physical cores, so the virtual CPUs of the same virtual core are always kept together, even if one of them is idle, like here in this picture, virtual CPU 4 is still on the virtual core 1 in spite of being idle. And only if all siblings of a virtual core are idle, then the virtual core itself is regarded as being idle. So when I'm now running the virtual cores of the mu, even if I have idle virtual CPUs, here again in this virtual core, it can happen that a virtual core of the user domain is being blocked or is not being able to run because the other virtual CPU of DOM 0 is still active. So why would I want to do something like that? That seems to be suboptimal. Well, the main motivation for the CPU bugs coming up the last 1.5 years, especially L1TF and MDS suggested that it would be a nice idea to not mix virtual CPUs of different guests on the same core. Because due to those bugs, it would be possible to have side channel attacks to the other sibling, and then mixing up different guests on the same core would leak some data. But that's not the only reason to do that. I will come to that later, sorry. So core scheduling prohibits cross-domain side channel attacks. Today, we are using, for being secure, we are switching SMT, so symmetric multithreading, off in the hypervisor to avoid these side channel attacks. But using core scheduling isn't all we need for that to happen, because we would need some hypercall synchronization as well. That is the topic Wei was talking about, for example, to avoid leaking other mapped hypervisor data to the other thread. Another reason is fairness of accounting. So when I'm running threads on the same core, they're sharing resources like execution units, TLBs, or caches. So they influence each other regarding performance. For example, when only one vCPU is active on a core, this vCPU can have a higher performance as if two vCPUs are active on the same core. So this results in, when we have CPU scheduling, the guest CPU performance is depending on the host load, not alone on the load of the guest. For example, if I'm running a cloud business and the guest owner has to pay for the used CPU time, this is a little bit unfair if he has to pay more just because the cloud service is running more guests on the same host. Another thing are guest-side optimizations. With core scheduling, a guest can decide to let run only one thread of a core on a core to make use of all resources of that core in a single thread. And if the guest has some optimized scheduling, it might be able to use shared resources on several threads when running those threads on the same core. This is not possible when I have only CPU scheduling, because the guest will see always different setups between the vCPUs. And again, the guest might want to mitigate against CPU bugs via core-aware scheduling, which is, of course, only possible if the guest vCPUs are scheduled in a consistent manner, so via core scheduling in the hypervisor. So how does this all work? The main idea is to decouple scheduling from CPUs. So instead of scheduling vCPUs, I'm now scheduling SCHED units, just another name. And I'm not scheduling the SCHED units on physical CPUs, but on SCHED resources. So the scheduler is no longer seeing vCPUs, but only things to schedule on physical resources. The decisions for doing the scheduling should be more or less the same as before, but maybe the scheduler is just seeing less units to schedule on less resources. This, of course, needs rather many changes in the hypervisor scheduling code, but most of those changes are rather mechanical, just renamings and a little bit different structures, but the real code isn't changed that much in regards of all the decisions. The central scheduler.c source file is acting as an abstraction layer for the rest of the hypervisor. So the other hypervisor code dealing with vCPUs doesn't have to change, or only a little bit. Due to those abstractions, it is interesting that I can not only use a core for a scheduling resource, but a socket as well. I've done that in my pet series implementing core scheduling. So it is, in fact, possible to use socket scheduling as well. Not sure if anybody wants to do that, but it's possible, rather easy.
It's probably more interesting to do file size scheduling with Intel CPU.
Yeah, sure. So I've put some socket scheduling code in there. It's, I think, less than 50 lines of code. Doing the same for NUMA nodes, dice, or whatever is more or less, just a few lines of code needed. It was more proof of concept. Another important part of the core scheduling stuff is the syncing of context switches. I want to avoid at any time running two different guests on the same core. So when switching vCPUs on a CPU, all other vCPUs of the same scheduling unit must be switched on all other CPUs of the scheduling resource. So this syncing is done in two steps. First, the scheduler is doing a scheduling decision. This is no problem yet. And then when I know which new scheduling unit is to be scheduled, I need to gather all other vCPUs running on the same core in scheduling code of the hypervisor. Then I can do the context switch in parallel on all affected CPUs. And after that, the CPUs have to rendezvous again before they can proceed, to be sure that only ever the same guest is running on one core. So there's no time when two vCPUs of different guests or different scheduling units are running in guest mode on the same scheduling resource. So what happens in detail is I have a schedule event on one CPU, take the schedule log as today, call the scheduler, credit to whatever, for selecting the next schedule unit to run. If there's no change, because it can run on, I can just drop the log and exit. Otherwise, I have to ping all other CPUs of the SCED resource to process a new slave event, then drop the log and wait for all other CPUs to join. And the last CPU coming in to join switches the scheduling unit on the resource and frees the other CPUs to continue. Then each CPU is doing its context switch. This is done in parallel. And then, of course, all CPUs wait until all context switches are done and then can leave schedule handling. It should be noted that after dropping the log, when waiting for joining the others, so at point 3, I don't need any logging any longer. The other joining is done complete log-free. Another point is that a guest vCPU becoming idle will still result in the idle vCPU to be scheduled. This was a change Andrew requested, and it wasn't the worst change, I think. I had some different code in the beginning, in the early phases of my series, but this was rather problematic. So when the guest vCPU becoming idle, I just schedule the idle vCPU without needing to synchronize with other CPUs, of course, because of core scheduling, doesn't make any change if the guest CPU is idle or not. On x86, we have optimization in place, even today, that there's no need to reload control register 3, so changing the address space. When switching between a guest vCPU and the idle vCPU, this is only done when a new guest CPU is scheduled. So when I have no scheduling unit switch on a CPU and switching to idle, I don't need to switch the address space, so I'm sparing some cycles here. And this, in fact, is, of course, another optimization so I'm avoiding to have any hypervisor address space active when a guest vCPU is running. I've made the design decision to not run any tasklets or live patching, do any live patching when an idle vCPU is running in a guest scheduling unit to avoid poisoning the caches with any other hypervisor data. Especially tasklets are used here and there for performing guest-related actions. For example, continue hypercall on another physical CPU is done in a tasklet. So I don't want to have that active on a core which is running another guest vCPU. CPU pools are affected as well. Of course, having a core where the two CPUs are active in different CPU pools is doesn't make very much sense, because then I couldn't ever schedule anything on those. So I can only move complete scheduling resources from or to CPU pools. When considering CPU hot plug, I found that it's a bad idea to manage CPUs not in any CPU pool in scheduling units again, because then it would be impossible to offline a single CPU. So CPUs not in any CPU pool are handled individually, which on the other hand lays nice groundwork for being able to support CPU pools with different scheduling granularity in the future. It was necessary to populate the initial CPU pool only after all CPUs have come up, because otherwise I wouldn't know how many CPUs a single scheduling resource has, because I need to see the topology before being able to split up or to combine the CPUs to scheduling resources. And additionally, it was much easier to introduce just another very, very, very basic idle scheduler handling the CPUs not in any pool, so which just being able to schedule the idle vCPU, because then I could drop a lot of nasty side effects to the scheduling code. So CPU hot plug had to be modified a little bit as well. The runtime SMT on-off switching had to be disabled with core scheduling active, of course, because when I'm doing that, when I'm disabling SMT with active core scheduling, suddenly all guests would see vanishing CPUs, which is not a good idea. Before this series, offlining a CPU was only possible with the CPU being in CPU pool 0, so assigned to CPU pool. This had to be dropped, of course, because I can offline single CPUs, but only move complete scheduling resources from the CPU pool. And the same for onlining. Onlining a CPU will add it only to CPU pool 0 in case the complete scheduling resource is online. So when I have a normal standard configured system with all CPUs in CPU pool 0, when I'm offlining the CPU, I will first need to move the virtual core or the physical core out of CPU pool 0, and then can offline the single CPU. And then I will have one unused CPU, which I can offline as well, or when I'm onlining the CPU again, I can put it to CPU pool 0 again. Now the interesting part, the performance numbers of the whole stuff. I was very lucky that Dario did most of the performance testing. I did only some very basic initial tests, and from there on, Dario carried on with the performance tests, which he was able to finish late last week, so just in time. He tested basically on a 4-core system with hyperthreading, so 8 CPUs. DOM 0 was always running with 8 vCPUs. Of course, when running hyperthreading off, it had only 4 vCPUs. He tested with HVM DOMUs with 4 or 8 vCPUs. And all the scenarios were tested without any patches with hyperthreading on. As the initial numbers, and then he did some tests with without the patches, hyperthreading switched off. Then with the patches, with a normal scheduling granularity CPU, so as today, with hyperthreading on and off, and then the scheduling granularity core. So basically, we have 5 sets of data, where the initial data is the basic, so I've only 4 comparisons for each test. He did run several benchmarks, a stream benchmark, which is a memory benchmark running 4 tasks in parallel, a kern bench, which is doing kernel build with 2, 4, 8, or 16 threads. Hack bench is communication of multiple threads via pipes. The machine always saturated. Mutilate is a load generator for memcached. He did some netperf tests, TCP, UDP, Unix, socket tests, 2 communicating tasks. And PGIO perf is a Postgres micro benchmark. So those numbers are very strange sometimes, so don't take them with only a grain of salt, but take a whole pound of salt for them. Okay, first, running only DOM0, nothing else. Stream benchmark is rather straightforward, so switching hyperthreading off didn't change that much because the machine isn't under extreme heavy load. Putting the patches in place, interesting enough, the patches always produce better performance with hyperthreading on. Not very much, but a little bit. Switching hyperthreading off is, in some cases, even better. And if it's worse than unpatched, it's even better than the unpatched no hyperthreading. So this seems to be a clear win. On the other hand, when switching to core scheduling, numbers are a little bit worse. So stream benchmark is no case where you want to have core scheduling, I think. Kern bench, of course, when I switch hyperthreading off, there are some test cases where performance is much worse, so dropping 37% about. When I have higher performance, this is the case where I don't have that many threads running. With the patches, hyperthreading on, it's more or less the same performance as without patches, so not very clear picture here. When I switch hyperthreading off with the patches in place, I'm about the same performance as the unpatched version. When I switch to core scheduling, I'm clearly better than hyperthreading off, which is the main purpose of the core scheduling. I'm a little bit worse, or measurably worse than with CPU scheduling. Hackbench is small, is a similar picture, little bit higher numbers. So hyperthreading off can cost me about 67%. That's quite high. With the patches in place, I have sometimes even higher performance gain, but in other cases, more performance loss, so it's more or less the same. With hyperthreading off, it's very comparable to the unpatched version, maybe a little bit better. And with core scheduling, it's even, I would say, Hackbench. Why not with core scheduling? Mutilate is, well, hyperthreading off is mixed bag, so between -20 plus 10%. The patches in place cost a little bit performance, but not too much. Again, with the patches in place and hyperthreading off, it's a little bit better than without the patches. And core scheduling is, well, I'd say mostly better than with hyperthreading off, but not always. NetPerf is, again, well, not that bad with the patches, I would say. But with core scheduling, I can lose lots of performance. And I can understand that because NetPerf is using lots of ping pong between virtual CPUs. And here, I guess, the larger overhead between scheduling, when scheduling virtual cores is really observable. And PGIO-perf is, well, yes, more or less okay, I'd say. The performance loss with -12.5% with the patches is not too good, of course, but as I said, the PGIO-perf is very strange in some. We will see that later. It's absolutely ridiculous in parts. When I'm using a 4V CPU HVM-DOMU, I'm only saying some, so I'm not discussing all numbers here. What is interesting is the really seeable performance loss with core scheduling active. But that's easy understandable if you look at the normal Xen scheduling policy. When I have mostly only 4 vCPUs active and CPU scheduling, the Credit 2 scheduler will try to spread the active vCPUs over all cores. So leaving one thread of each core idle, and the other core will run the vCPU. When I have a 4 vCPU DOMU and core scheduling active, of course, always 2 vCPUs are bundled into a virtual core. So now I'm running only on 2 cores. And this is the reason why the core scheduling in this case is much worse from the performance, because I'm on a machine not completely filled, so not completely under load, so I won't use all the cores any longer. But PGIO-perf is again acting strangely, completely. So that's the only benchmark winning from that situation. I have no idea why it does so. I'm thinking about that. Maybe there's something wrong in the automatic data reduction. So it's maybe thinking that large numbers are bad or good, and it's the other way around in reality. I don't know. So when running HVM-DOMU with 8 vCPUs, you can see that in many cases, core scheduling is much better than before with the 4 vCPU case. So I'm not losing that much performance. Especially, you can look at the Hackbench, for example. I'm more or less on the same performance numbers again as with CPU scheduling. And here, yeah, okay, PGIO-perf is doing strange things again. And now things are going worse. So the last line, minus 6,000%. So minus is worse, and 6,000 means, in this case, it's about 60 times slower than before. So it's not running backwards very fast, but so with a machine with overcommitment, so I've always more active vCPUs than physical CPUs available. So with core scheduling in the stream benchmark, I'm clearly better than the hyperthreading off with no patches again. Kernbench isn't doing too bad, I would say. PGIO perf is doing nasty things again, okay, but of course, I've very many performance numbers here. In fact, those were much more, so Dario will post the complete performance data, I think, tomorrow morning. So he will post all the numbers to Xentable mailing list. So what is the current state of all this stuff? Some patches are already committed. Those were more or less independent from the real core scheduling, just needed work to put everything in shape for core scheduling to be possible. There was a small series in removing CPU on offlining hooks for scheduler for suspend resume handling, because those were only software states. This simplified scheduling code for CPU on offlining a lot. There was a bug in credit 2 for SMT aware scheduling. I added some inline wrappers for calling the per scheduler functions from schedule.c, making things a little bit clearer. And some mandatory per scheduler functions are now tested when booting the system instead of asserts in the respective places. And I did an interface change in a special per scheduler function to avoid code duplication. The main series is in review now. This is still consisting of 57 patches within rather large changelog, so 40 files are affected with several thousand lines changed. Unfortunately, the maintainer load seems to be quite high, so only a rather small part has been reviewed up to now. Thanks for the reviewers, but I'm waiting for more comments. And all comments on the RFC series have been addressed up to now. I'm working now on the comments I've seen so far and waiting for more to come. So future plans. One thing which has come up is that it would be a good idea to do a rework of the scheduler framework in Xen by moving all the scheduler-related files to a common subdirectory and making the normally scheduler private header get interface.h really scheduler private, for not needing it to include it in many, many sources. Up to now, the core scheduling is x86 only because I'm not, I don't want to change the ARM context switching code, which I'm not so familiar with. So there would need some help from ARM maintainers. I'd like to officially support per CPU pool scheduling granularity. This should be rather easy. It's more or less an interface kind of things, so Xen tooling. Same for per CPU pool SMT setting. This should be rather easy as well. A little bit more work would be same topology reporting to the guests, which is a pending work waiting for the CPU ID and MSR framework Andrew is working on for many years now. And every time he wanted to do something, a new CPU bug is was coming up, I think. Yeah, so more or less. So yeah, but I think with core scheduling, the topology reported to guests is a little bit better than before, because today, especially PD guests are seeing the thread and core information. They just happen to run on when they query it. So now with core scheduling active, they will see correct thread information because virtual threads are always running on the correct physical thread. That's a little bit better than before.
So it's whichever thread the dollar, the main builder, from 0 to run on some CPU policy.
Yeah, but that's the same. With core scheduling active, it will run each virtual CPU. Virtual CPUs will always run on odd threads.
At the moment, what happens, both threads will get the same information. It happens to be wherever, whichever thread the main builder happens to run on. In this way, it's the main thread. The information is very bogus.
Yeah, okay. And another thing, so as I said, this is the groundwork for mitigation of current CPU problems, because now with core scheduling active, I'm giving the guest the guarantee that it will always have a sibling running on the same core where he can use side channel attacks. So we would need hypercall syncing between threads for full L1TF or MDS mitigation, which probably kills performance. But on the other hand, maybe in future we will have CPUs without L1TF and MDS, and another side channel will open up on those CPUs. There, core scheduling could be a good idea. That's basically all. Any questions? So asymmetric cores, more or less. So big and little or something like that. Yeah, yeah. So when Xen scheduling supports big little, it will here as well. So it's something the scheduler should look at when scheduling vCPUs, so it should look at the same when scheduling vCores, right? That's no difference in this regard. Yeah, but the same as on physical CPUs then. It's no difference, more or less. Oh, you mean if a guest has an odd number of vCPUs? Yes, so then it's more or less the same as if you boot a bare metal system and restricting the CPUs to be used to an odd number. So in the end, one vCPU will be always idle then. But the guest will see, of course, only the odd number of vCPUs, but the scheduling unit will always have one idle. The last scheduling unit will always have one idle vCPU. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, as I said, so when I look here, so when I look here in a picture like that, with CPU scheduling, the Xen scheduler will have one vCPU here, one here, one here, one here, because it can spread the vCPUs as it likes to the cores, and it does that. And with core scheduling, I will have them, of course, grouped together. It can't rip them apart. So I will only use two cores in this case. Yeah, but I have, at the same time, I have less items to schedule or less units to schedule. So when why do I have no? I have, with core scheduling, I have 4 resources to schedule on. And I have, with a 4 vCPU guest, I have 2 units. And with a 8 vCPU guest, I have 4 units. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. But the main, this is just a picture, the main performance, the normal run, DOM0 isn't so important. So the main performance data is gathered from DOM-U running. DOM0 is running at 2, 3, or 4% of the time. So in most cases, I have only DOM-U vCPUs running on the system. And looking at that, then the CPU scheduling, I will use all cores, and with core scheduling, I will use only 2 cores. And that's the reason why the 4 vCPU case is so much worse with core scheduling, because the system is only under 50% load. As soon as I would have 2 4 vCPU guests, it would be fine again.
Okay. It does raise the question, and this is very definitely in the future work and not current work, of when we get into a situation like that where we are underutilized on resource level, we could, in principle, split the vCPUs per core and per thread. So in this example here, we just have DOM0 using 0 vCPUs
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we always have to schedule two threads on the same.
So what you're saying is basically mirroring this over and letting those two idle more or less.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we could even leave the problem is then you have again the kind of unfair accounting.
But if you only do that when you're idle,
Still, you've got kind of unfair accounting, and in case the guest wants to schedule two threads on the same core because they're tightly coupled and are using the same cache data, for example, this would be negative for the guest. So it's a little bit difficult.
well, look, you don't need nothing else to say.
Yeah.
You don't want to just mix and match half of the that doesn't make sense at all. In the case that you have either resource, moving them out as though you've got one you on core as opposed to one you on thread is probably better overall. Maybe not in like like trouble account scenario, but it certainly makes the performance numbers for core get.
So yeah, it's a little bit, it's really difficult. On the other hand, you would have power savings when you concentrate on a core, right? Okay. Thanks.